The realization of Augustus' policy of large-scale conquest depended directly on controlling the communications connecting Italy with the territories north of the Alps. The conquest and Romanization of the Alpine region is of great importance for the future history of Europe. Nevertheless, it is one of the events least covered in the sources. It is only thanks to new archaeological discoveries that the shroud of obscurity has been lifted. Italy is separated from the rest of the continent in the north by the Alps, an obstacle that is difficult to overcome, but nevertheless quite passable. Even in ancient times, a number of routes through the Alps were laid out. In ancient times, the mountains and narrow valleys were inhabited by small warlike peoples of Celtic and Ligurian origin. These Highlanders not only charged money to travelers crossing their domain, but also made devastating raids on both sides of the Alps. During the wars with the Ligurians in defense of the Massaliotes, the Romans repeatedly crossed the Alps. After victories over the Gauls Allobroge and Arverni, they even created a special province on the lands lying between the Alps and the banks of the Rhone. In doing so, the Romans used the western passes in the Pennine and Graian Alps, which were controlled by the Selassians. The consul Appius Claudius defeated this tribe. However, because of the heavy losses suffered, the Roman Senate did not consider it possible to grant him the right to celebrate the triumph. On the territory occupied by the consul in the valley of Aosta, Romans founded Epiradia, but the mountain passes still remained in the hands of the Selassians. The mountaineers charged travelers money for the possibility of passage. Strabo reported that they had to pay even Julius Caesar, on whose troops the mountaineers threw stones. And with Decimus Brutus they demanded and received a drachma per person. During the conquest of Gaul, Caesar also made use of the western Alpine passes. Having defeated the Helvets and made a successful campaign against the Belgae, he sent Servius Galba with a legion and part of his cavalry into the lands of the Nantuates, Varegrians, and Sidonians. These tribes lived between Lake Leman, the banks of the Rhone, and the northern foothills of the Alps. After several successful battles and the capture of some fortifications, the Gauls agreed to provide hostages and made peace. For the winter, Galba and his troops encamped with the Varegris at Octother. After a few days of wintering, the Gauls changed their minds. They took up arms again, occupied the surrounding heights, and attacked the Roman camp. Galba, although his troops were far inferior to the enemy in numbers, still successfully repelled the attack. However, as Caesar himself says, not wanting to test fate, he left the camp and went to winter in the territory of the province. Caesar was convinced that the reason for the attack was the fears of the Gauls. They believed that the Romans would try to occupy the Alpine mountains not only to provide themselves with roads, but also to permanently secure them for themselves and to annex to their possessions this country as a neighbor to the province. The Romans put up with the independence of the mountaineers for a very long time, believing that the forces and means necessary for their conquest could not be repaid by the trifling booty that would be given to the victor. Therefore, they preferred to make agreements with local chiefs and pay them off with money. The decision to conquer the Alpine region was not made until after the civil wars had ended. Augustus, in order to justify his state of emergency and the maintenance of a professional army, announced an ambitious foreign policy program for the conquest of the world. Even earlier, Antistius Vetus had defeated the Selassians living in the Graian and Pennine Alps. However, the success achieved was short-lived. The barbarians soon drove away the Roman garrisons and resumed their brigandage attacks. Sending against them, Avulus Terentius Varrone Murena again forced the Selassians into submission. He persuaded them to surrender, for the sake of appearances agreeing to limit themselves to the collection of the usual tribute. Then, under the pretext of collecting money, small detachments of soldiers were sent to remote settlements. Finally, on a day appointed in advance, they simultaneously attacked the barbarians living there, capturing and selling into slavery 36,000 people. of whom 8,000 were men capable of bearing arms. The buyers of the captives were forbidden to release them before 30 years had passed, so as to make their return home impossible. After these events, the name of the Selassians disappeared from history, and on the site of the Roman military camp grew the colony of Augustus Praetoria, which became an important outpost of the Roman presence in the region. A new phase of hostilities began after the completion of the conquest of Spain, when Rome was able to transfer to the Alpine front military units previously occupied there. The governor of Illyria, Publius Silius Nerva, according to Cassius Dion's brief account, quelled a revolt by the Communian and Benian tribes. The campaign was unprecedented both in terms of the number of troops involved and the scale of the entire military operation. The offensive was to be conducted simultaneously in several directions at once, in order to take the defenders in a pincer. The strategic plan was to attack the enemy simultaneously from several directions. The first column under the command of Tiberius included legions and auxiliary troops from Gaul. It was to advance from the provincial capital Lugduna to the east and pass along the northern foothills of the Alps. A force under Drusus was to march towards this column from Verona in Italy through the Brenner Pass. They were subsequently stationed in the newly conquered territories as a garrison. Finally, between these two columns a third group of troops was to operate, advancing from Mediolanus, Milan, through Septimer Pass to the north. How the campaign was conducted, we know in some detail from the numerous historical and poetic works of the time, glorifying the victories of Roman arms and the personal participation of members of the imperial family. As soon as the Alpine passes were cleared of snow, the first to go on the offensive group under the command of Drusus. Moving from Verona up the Adige River valley, along the route of the future Via Claudia, the troops reached Trident. Here they destroyed a large enemy detachment blocking their way. Then, passing through the Brenner Pass, the Roman troops moved northward into the Rhaetian Alps, successfully overcoming resistance and tearing down the mountaineers' fortifications along the way. The final point of their route was appointed the area of modern Augsburg. At the same time Tiberius with his group came out of Lugdun, through the Langra Plateau went to the upper reaches of the Rhine and through the area of Vindonissa reached Lake Constance. Here from one island, most likely Mainau, the troops crossed the lake and on August 1 gained a double victory over the army and flotilla of the Vindelics who lived here. Antique sources emphasize the fierce nature of the resistance and the great sacrifices among the local population. Annius Florus wrote, "What was the savagery of the Alpine tribes? It is easy to show by the example of their women. For lack of throwing implements they smashed the heads of their infants on the ground and threw them in the face of the soldiers. To eliminate the possibility of future resistance, the victors forcibly relocated the local inhabitants to the plains. Only a small number of inhabitants were left in their original place, enough to keep the country from being completely depopulated, but too few to revolt. As a result of the military campaign, the Romans conquered the country from the southern foothills of the Alps to the upper reaches of the Danube, which roughly corresponds to the territory of modern Switzerland. The following year they subjugated the Ligurians, who lived in the maritime Alps. The local dynast Cottius became a Roman prefect and governed the territory that later received his name, the Cottian Alps. The conquest of the eastern part of the Alpine arc was only completed with the subjugation of the Norics who lived there and the suppression of the revolt of the Pannonians. This opened the way for the Romans to conquer the middle Danube region. The management of the conquered territories was carried out by the military command. The Roman power strengthened its position in the region by means of a permanent military presence, building a network of roads and establishing settlements. One of the camps founded at this time was Dangstetten, which housed 5,000 soldiers. In the area of modern Augsburg on the place of the military camp of Drusa was founded Augusta of Vindelics, which became the center of the province of Rhaetia. The most important monument of monumental propaganda is the grandiose trophy of Augustus erected in La Turbie, Monaco, which lists the names of 45 conquered Alpine tribes.